My name's Jennifer Patel and I'm Business Support Officer here for CECA Yorkshire and Humber. We're grateful as always to Sarah Wilson from Bevan, Brittan, who's going to be taking you through today's webinar looking at NEC 3 and 4, specifically options C and D. Now, the webinar itself will last about an hour, and if anybody does have any questions while Sarah's going through the slides, if you want to use either the chat function or the Q&A function, and then Sarah will be happy to answer any questions that come in at the end of today's session. I will send a copy of the slides on email to yourselves afterwards, and I'll also upload a recording of the session, as you've probably got the notification that today's session is going to be recorded. And if anybody wants any a certificate, for CPD purposes, then again, just pop me an email over after the session today, and I'll be happy to produce one for you. So without any further ado, Sarah, I'll hand over to yourself. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jen. Afternoon, everyone. So, yes, today we are looking at options C and D of the NEC form of contract. So we're looking at both NEC 3 and 4, albeit that, as you'll be aware, they are substantially the same as each other as regards these two forms of contract. So if we can move on, I think probably 2 slides, Jen. Yeah, so that's just a bit about me, which we don't need to know about. So if we can move on to the next one. Yeah, so today what we're going to look at with regards to C and D is the procedures to be followed, because it's NEC, so we know there are always going to be some procedures. This is, spoiler alert, that this is the C and D are the pay and gain, the sharing contracts. So we're going to look at setting the percentages, how any pain or gain is shared between the parties. And also the impact of any compensation events. So, of course, compensation events are items that are the employer or the client's risk in a contract, the contractor's risk in a subcontract, which entitle the party carrying out the work, the contractor or a subcontractor in a subcontract, to extra time and extra money. So, how is that factored into the C and D forms of contract? So next slide, please, Jan. Okay, so just to put this in a little bit of context, and like lots of these webinars, I'm going to kind of start quite high level and gradually get into more detail as we go along. So options C and D fit in terms of the NEC contracts consisting of options A to F. So they are all pricing options. So they can all of them be a design and build, or they can just be a build contract. So the A to F is how the work is going to be priced and paid for. So if we exclude option F, because that's a management contract, we've got options A to E. And A and E are sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. So option A is your fixed price contract with an activity schedule. The activity schedule is important for today. And E is cost reimbursable contract. So basically, option A is a fixed price contract. Option E is you paid for the work that you carry out as you go along, subject to certain checks and balances. So you don't just get paid whatever you want to be paid, for example. The option B, again, is a fixed price contract, but it's less fixed price, if that makes sense, than option A, because it's based on a bill of quantities. So there is some element of remeasurement allowed within that fixed price. Again, the bill of quantities is relevant for today, because what we have sort of in the middle of our spectrum are options C and D, which is what we're looking at today. So C is a target contract, so that's the pay and gain element that I'm going to be talking about. So essentially, a target price is fixed and agreed between the parties, and the pay and gain depends on whether the actual cost of the works comes in under or over that target cost. So that's the target element. So option C, so they're both target contracts, as you can see there. Option C is based on an activity schedule. So similar to option A, and option D is based on a bill of quantities. So we'll come back to that in a bit more detail, but bear it in mind. So kind of colloquially speaking, what the option C and D contracts are is a sort of, in inverted commas, mashup of options A and B on the one hand and option E on the other, which will become apparent as we go on. So if we can have the next slide, please, Jan. Okay, so I've already made this point. So I've said here the most popular construction contract in the UK, not necessarily abroad, is a design and build. So all of these pricing options can apply whether the contract is design and build or just the build options. So options C and D, as we've already said, are alternatives to the other pricing options A, B, E, and arguably F. But it's effectively supposed to be a risk sharing pricing option. So when I say, in inverted commas, it's a mashup, you've got the fixed price of options A and B, which form the target cost to the options C and D of the contract. So option C, the activity schedule sets out the target cost. Option D, it's the bill of quantities. But as with A and B, they are slightly variable. So in particular, as I've already alluded to, with option with the bill of quantities, there is the potential for an element of remeasurement. And the risk sharing comes, as I've already said, depending on whether the actual price of the work comes in under that target, so under the figure in the activity schedule stroke bill of quantities, or exceeds it. So if we can have the next slide, please, Jen. So just to take a step back for a minute, we've still got several core clauses. So all of our typical core clauses apply, but some of the key ones here: clause 1, mutual trust and cooperation. We've got collaboration there, but it's cooperation. The flagship clause of NEC, that still applies to options C and D, as it does to options A, B, E and F. We still have the EWN, the early warning notice requirements for both parties to basically warn as soon as something significant happens in terms of health and safety issue, increasing the price, extending the programme on a neutral basis. So it's not necessarily, if the contractor submits it, it's not necessarily meaning that the contractor is responsible for it. It is just warning that, as a matter of fact, something significant has happened. We still have the risk register to note down any potential risks. And of course, remember, that's not about how the risks are shared. Again, it is just setting out, as a matter of fact, what are the risks on this project. So, a project where there's winter working, the weather may be a risk. It goes into the risk register. That doesn't then determine how the risk is apportioned in terms of the impact it has. If there is some bad weather, that's dealt with separately under the compensation events, which brings us to the final bullet point, which are compensation events. So if you come to these seminars, usually you'll be aware of the compensation events. It's the equivalent under JCT to 3 things. variations stroke extra work, extensions of time and loss and expense regarding the extensions of time. So the compensation event covers all of those items. So again, the compensation event clauses apply with options C and D as they do with A, B, E and F. So if we can have the next slide, please, Jen. Okay, so looking at the target element of the contract. So we know that the activity schedule or bill of quantities basically sets the target. So that will go into the contract when the contract is signed between the parties and after they've agreed the target. So the only real adjustment that you can have to the target is by reference to compensation events, the CEs that happen through the project. So that, if you think about that logically, it makes sense. It would be really unfair if you had a target cost against which you were going to work out a pain gain share. And an employer stroke client could instruct extra work or risks that it's responsible for, and that target didn't increase as a result, because that would then impact adversely on the contractor or the subcontractor in a subcontract. So the target cost is increased, or it could be decreased because you can have compensation events that reduce the cost. But anyway, so the CE's impact on the target cost. And again, that's pretty logical, because if you're familiar with NEC, when we go through the compensation event process, clause 65/66 in NEC 3 and 4 is about implementing compensation events. So that's about incorporating them into the contract. So for example, with the activity schedule with option A, and in this case with option C, once the compensation event has been either agreed by the project manager or assessed, it's then implemented, which effectively means it makes its way into the activity schedule, and the party doing the work, contractor or subcontractor, can apply for payment for that work once it's completed the work. So the activity schedule is going to change as the project moves on, but only as regards compensation events. Bill of quantity is slightly different in that it will change as regards compensation events, and also if there's any element of remeasurement. There's also an issue because, of course, this is increasing the target cost, the figure at which we assess whether there's a pain gain sharing, whether it's pain or gain, between the parties. So in practice, typically what you will have towards the end of the project is some compensation events where the compensation is agreed, somewhere it's not agreed. So fundamentally, the pain gain sharing may not be agreed when it's finally carried out by the project manager. And it may be that the contractor subcontractor has to adjudicate to ascertain the value of all the compensation events that are in dispute in order for the proper value of the pain gain sharing to be ascertained. We'll come on to that a bit later. So if we can have the next slide, please. So just going back a little bit to trying to work out the target cost. So obviously this is done through contract negotiation before the contract's executed. The target cost, as with the activity schedule and the bill of quantities, will be incorporated, sewn into the contract. So it's important, even though this isn't an option A or B, so they're not fixed price contracts, but for obvious reasons, the target needs to be as accurate as possible. So the second bullet point, this means that if it's set too early, this could cause problems for the contractor. or in reality, the paying party, the employer, because you could end up with a target that's way too high or way too low. Former not great for the paying party, the latter not great for the contractor. So it is important that some time is spent in trying to calculate a reasonable value for the target cost. And also the final bullet point here is what we will see is how NEC deals with the pain gain sharing, and it's not just as simple as I don't know, the target's 3.5 million, the costs come in at 3 million, and the contract says we share it 50-50 or 75-25 or whatever. It's slightly more complicated than that. But what you need to be aware of is the sort of ultimate cost, and in particular for contractors and subcontractors, just be careful that the contract doesn't require all of the pain to be borne by the contractor, subcontractor, whichever party you're representing, because that's not a great scenario, and it kind of defeats the object in a way of having a pain gain from a contractor or subcontractor's perspective. I would imagine you're probably better off having a fixed price contract if that's going to be the case. So if we can have the next slide, please. Okay, so I've covered some of this already. So we've talked about setting the target price, how it's adjusted as you go along. So at what point is the pain gain payment determined? Well, the contract requires it. Oh, thanks. The contract states that the work is completed, so you get to completion, and at that point the project manager makes the sort of first or provisional assessment of the pain gain. Sort of makes sense because at completion the parties should be pretty clear as to what the project has cost. So we'll come back to how you work out what it has cost as compared to the target price, which of course is the activity schedule, stroke bill of quantities plus compensation events. So practical completion, it's the first sort of provisional assessment by the project manager. And then the final assessment by the project manager is at the end of the defects period. My suspicion is that in most instances, that final one is probably just a slight change, unless there've been adjudications to determine the valuation of compensation events through that defects period, in which case there might be a greater assessment to do following those adjudications determining the compensation events. So that's how it works under NEC. The final bullet point refers to a case, Doosan, Ampure and Interserve. So that's 2019 case. And in that case, what happened, and this is relatively common in my experience, the contractor, so this was a joint venture, but for the purposes today, it was effectively an NEC. I can't remember whether it was option C or D. I think it was an option C contract. But before the parties got to completion, it became very, very clear that this was going to be in a pain situation. And because the contractor, the party doing the work and being paid, gets paid for the work as they go along, and then it's only at completion when the project manager can do that first assessment as to the pain gain sharing. And if it's in a pain situation, the project manager can require and will require the contractor to pay some money back to the employer in accordance with the pain gain sharing provisions. The paying party, in this case Interserve, were getting concerned because they were paying and they knew that this was going to be in a paying situation and they were going to be paid money back from Doosan on Pure at completion. They obviously got a little bit nervous. So before completion, they went to court to say, look, court, it's really clear this is going to be a paying situation. So we should be able to deduct the money as we go along. We shouldn't have to wait until completion. I think they were possibly concerned about insolvency as well. That would explain why. And that we were talking large sums of money here. Anyway, the court looked at it and said, no, 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 no. The contract clearly says the pain gain assessment doesn't take place until completion. So there's no facility in the contract to do it earlier. So that's pretty clear cut. However, as a result of this case, what we are time the contract being amended. So the pain gain assessment is done sometimes with every interim assessment, sometimes every few months. So again, that will be done as a Z clause. Again, what you need to think about when you're negotiating the contract is, which situation would be best for you and which, is it important? Because it works both ways, really. If the pain gain is going to be assessed as you go along, that's good for the contractor. If they're in a gain situation, because it means that you get additional money on a monthly or interim basis rather than having to wait till completion. But of course, vice versa, the opposite applies if it's in a pain situation. What you need to be careful of is a scenario which says if it's in a pain situation, then the employer stroke client can claw the money back, but it doesn't work both ways. So just be careful with that. I think I've seen that once. So next slide, please. So I think we've probably covered this. So target contracts, some of the fundamentals. So the target price. Oh, sorry, can we just go back, Jen? Thank you. So we've got the AS, the activity schedule and bill of quantities, sets the target price. So I call it target price, but the language in NEC is they call it prices. I just find the terminology sometimes it doesn't to me, it doesn't kind of necessarily say what it means. The next bullet point, contract data part 1. So this is the part that the employer, the paying party, completes. So in a subcontract, the contractor completes it. So we'll see this later on. We've got the extract from the contract, but it sets out the pay and gain sharing mechanism. It is critical that this bit is completed for obvious reasons. How do we know how the pay and gain is going to be shared? Is it 50-50, 25-75? How do we know unless it's set out in the contract? So if you know you're on an option C or D, you need to be checking these provisions because you'll probably have your own views as to how what percentages you would require. Third bullet point, target price adjusted. So that's the prices is adjusted with compensation events. Check, we've covered that. And then I said that I would come back to what stroke how is the contractor or subcontractor paid as they go through the project and carry out the work. So up to PC, so completion, up to completion, what the contractor is paid is the defined costs, that is a defined term in the contract, minus the disallowed cost, plus the percentage fee. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail, but effectively your defined cost is the costs set out in the schedule of costs components. So it's basically a very high level aimed at the schedule of cost components. It's aimed at finding that base cost of everything on the project, so the base cost for the party carrying out the work. So If bricks are required, then the base cost typically is whatever the brick supplier has charged for the bricks. Extra and any extra fees if delivery is extra, and offloading, etc., etc. So you get that base cost. So then, of course, how is the contractor or subcontractor going to make any profit and cover its overheads? Well, that's covered in that percentage fee, the fee percentage. Where do we find that? Well, that's in the contract data part 2. It's used in all of the options, A to F. Fee percentage needs to be completed by the subcontractor. Disallowed costs, they're costs that the project manager can deduct, so costs the contractor or subcontractor is not entitled to. So it would include, for example, time spent by the contractor that's just wasted time. Have a day where nothing gets achieved because I don't know, the site manager or somebody relevant who is important on site for the contractor doesn't turn up, so that stops everyone else from working. That would be a disallowed cost for obvious reasons. And there are various others, less silly examples than that. So through the project, contractor is getting paid on an interim basis. So usually that would be every month or every 28 days. Sometimes it might be at certain milestones for the works that it has carried out. So that defined cost less the disallowed cost plus the fee percentage. And then at the end of the project, we have a figure. So at completion, we have a figure that the contractor has been paid, and we have our target price. And from that, we can assess whether we're in a pain situation, which means that what has been actually paid exceeds the target. So everybody's upset about that. No one's happy then. Or we have a gain situation, everyone's happy because the amount that the contractor has been paid is less than the target. So there's some money to be shared between the parties. So the next slide, please. So we've covered some of this. So the share pain gain is calculated at completion and then once the defects period has ended. So we've covered all of that. Yes. Oh, so final point here. So where it says similar to E, when I said colloquially, options C and D are sort of a mashup in inverted commas of A and B and E. We saw how A and B applies as regards the activity schedule, bill of quantities, compensation events are added. But it just relates to the target costs, in contrast to A and B, where that's what the contractor is paid in its interim payments as it completes the work. So what effectively contractor is being paid in its interim payments is the equivalent to an option E contract. So effectively that sums due under the schedule of cost component, which represents the defined cost plus the fee percentage. So next slide, please, Jan. So this is just a pictorial representation of what we're talking about. So it's what I'm referring to as the target price, the target cost. In NEC, it's referred to as the prices and the total of the prices. So we've seen this, but the prices are the activity schedule, a bill of quantities, add-on, next box, compensation events. They're costed through the schedule of cost components, and you get your fee percentage for compensation events. That gets you your target price, or the prices stroke total of the prices at the end of the project. So that's your adjusted target price effectively. Next slide, please. So then another pictorial representation, we've got, this is what I've called the instalment payments. So this is what contractor or subcontractor gets paid as they go through the project on a monthly milestone basis. So this is termed or defined in NEC as the price for work done to date, stroke defined costs. So you won't find, I don't think you'll find anything that talks about instalment payments. It's just, that's just sort of my colloquialism. So calculation here, we've seen this, it's the defined cost minus the disallowed cost plus the fee percentage equals the monthly instalment. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so we can, so sorry, they're just the clause numbers at the top, but it's basically repeating the last slide. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So this is disallowed cost. So again, we've got the clause numbers there. And the square, the kind of sub-bullets, which are little squares, they're some of the examples. They're kind of, for me, the main examples of items that the contractor isn't entitled to be paid for within its defined cost. So the first one is something that's not justified from the contractor's records. So, for example, if you claim, you know, some bricks, for example, and there's no invoice, you know, or there's no record of any bricks having been installed into the project, that can be deducted. So sort of, it's pretty logical. The other, another kind of important one are sums that are not due to the subcontractor. So, I mean, that could be because it's not due yet, because the contractor hasn't yet done that work. Or it could be that the subcontractor has no entitlement. Now, that would be rare, but if, for example, the subcontractor made a claim for something that in reality it wasn't entitled to, contractor pays the subcontractor, whether through mistake or not. The paying party, so the employer paying the contractor, would not have to pay that sum because it's not legitimately due under the subcontract to the subcontractor. Next one, sums incurred because the contractor didn't give an EWN an early warning notice or followed the wrong process. Also can be deducted contractor's cost of remedying defects. I mean, that makes sense. If the contractor hasn't done the work properly, then it shouldn't be entitled to charge the employer or the client for remedying the defects, for putting the work right. And then finally, the cost of preparing for an adjudication. If contractor includes that in its application, then that's a disallowed cost and can be deducted. And the basis of that is that each party has to pay its own costs in an adjudication. So that works for both parties. So they're sort of some of the high, sort of the main items of disallowed costs. They are not all of them. And as I said, the clause numbers are there if you want to go and read the clause at some point. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Jan. So just a quick note on the fee percentage. So the fee percentage should include contractors or subcontractors in a subcontract, overhead and profit, also insurance costs, and also there's a few other miscellaneous costs. Next slide, please. Right, we've covered that. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. And we have covered all of these. These are just the clause numbers for all of these terms. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so we've looked at how we set the target cost at the contract stage and how it gets adjusted as the project goes on through compensation events. We've looked at how the contractor gets paid on a month by month basis, and we've looked at how the project manager at completion and after the end of the defects period assesses what the pain gain amount is between the parties. So what I want to look at now, so these are clauses 53/54, is the, I suppose, procedure. It's sort of the mechanism for calculating the share at completion and at the end of the defect stage. And I've already said it's not just as simple as saying we're half a million under the target price, so we'll share it 50/50 or 25/75. It's done in it, so it says there in the second bullet point how it's set out in NEC is it's split into increments. So I'm hoping that the quantity surveyors in the room will understand this. You'll probably struggle with this less than I do. So I think if we move on to the next slide, what I'm going to do is, and the next slide, I'm going to look at a worked example, which sort of explains it better to me than actually talking about it. Before we do, however, this is the extract from the contract data part 1. So this is the really important information. So obviously the target cost is important. That goes in the contract data part 2. So that's the bit the contractor, subcontractor fills in. But this first bullet point is setting out the share range. So this is the increments that I was talking about. So you've got several share ranges here. In my example, we've got more than this, more share ranges. And it sets out the contractor share percentage on the right-hand side. So if you remember that left and right-hand side, because when we come to the example, I'll be referring to that. So what it means is, this is probably really obvious to you guys, but if, for example, we have a contractor share percentage of say 40% in here, that means that by necessity 60% goes to the paying party, the client stroke employer. So this is why this is really important for contractors to review before they sign the contract. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So this is just the contract data part 2 deals with that target cost. And if we can move to the next slide, please. Right, so this is the example. It looks hideous, but I'm hoping it'll all be pretty simple for you guys. So if you remember the contract data, and I said we've got the left and right hand side, first and second column here is basically representing the left and right hand side from the contract data. So I said, if you remember in my example, we had more, this was sliced in greater detail. I think we had 3 options in the contract data, but there are more here. So we've got, if you look down on the left-hand column, the share ranges. So we've got less than 80%, from 80 to 90%, from 90 to 110%, and greater than 110%. So they're the share ranges. So as soon as you get to 100%, you are at the target cost, the adjusted target cost at the end of the project. So once you're looking at 110%, that means you're in what I call a pain situation, because what the contractor is actually being paid exceeds the target cost. So obviously where it's greater than 110%, you're in a super pain situation, sadly. So the second column along has the contract data information. Do you remember the contractor's percentage? So we've got 15% as the first one. So, you know, on my analogy, that means, I think by my calculations, 85% of that share would go to the employer stroke the client, the paying party. The 30%, that means 70% goes to the paying party, etc. So in our scenario, so this is third column along, this is a really simple scenario. We have a target cost of £100,000. Excuse me. We've got to assume that that is the completion target. So all the compensation events are agreed and have been added, which gets us to a target cost of 100,000. So this is simply, this third column simply records where our share ranges start. So the first one says less than 80k. So any costing less than 80k, the contractor gets 15% of it, paying party gets 85% of it. Yeah. So, and that follows through for all of them. It's really easy here because we've got a target price of 100,000. Obviously, in most of the instances, the maths would be far more difficult. So our example one, we've got our target price of 100,000, the price for work done to date. So this is the completion cost, the amount the contract has been paid through the project is 75k. Happy days for everyone because the price has come in under the target. So that means there's some money to be shared between the parties, namely the 25k saving. How is it going to be shared? So this is my point. It's not just shared 50-50 or 70-30 to one stroke the other party. You have to work it out based on these increments. So if you look in the at example one, we've got a left and right column. If you look at the left, I hope this isn't too slow for everyone. The quantity surveyors in the room probably looked at this and thought, yeah, I can understand this, move on. So we've got £75,000 cost so far. So we've basically got £5,000 that is between 75 to 80,000. So within this share. So that's the 80% in our contract data, that far left-hand column. And the contract data, the second left-hand column, says that the contractor's share is 15%. So 15% of the 5k is that 0.75k. In the example one, right-hand side. The one below it that says 10k at 30%. So that's all of the 80% to 90%, which is the 80 to 90,000. So that's £10,000. Contractor gets 30% of it, which means the contractor gets 3,000. So example one, in the right-hand column, you've got the 0.75, you've got the 3k, you've also got the 5k, and at the end it says the total is 8.75k. That's right. Yep, the maths is right there. So we know that the contractor has already been paid 75k. That's its gain share, the 8.75. So the total the contractor is entitled to is 75k plus the 8.75 equals 83.75k. So that's its share. Obviously, the balance of that £25,000. So my maths isn't going to work on that. So the difference between 25,000 and the 8.75, that is the share that the employer, the paying party, keeps. So they do substantially better than the contractor here on that. But you can see that immediately from that second column along, because the percentages aren't particularly high from the contractor's perspective. There are two other examples there. I'm not going to go through them because I am a little bit conscious, as I've said, that the quantity surveyors in the room have probably fallen asleep now with my explanation in my dreadful maths. So, feel free to go through them at your own leisure. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So I think. I think we've covered all of that. Just to note, so clause numbers are there. If a compensation event reduces the price, then that means that in the same way as your activity schedule bill of quantities would be reduced under your options A and B, so your target would be reduced under options C and D. Next slide, please. Yep, so these are just more charts, but I think we've covered all of this. Actually, it has the contract clauses in, but it was just my way of trying to sort of get my head around how the target changed as the project went along, as opposed to what the contractor was paid. So that's just a representation of the target cost changing because of compensation events. So the next slide, please. So that's just dealing with compensation events, so we can move on. We've covered that, so we can move on. And so we've dealt with that, so we can move on. So I think, so this is just, so this is managing the forecast, which is what the contractor is paid as things go along. So again, it's just a representation, but you've got the contract clauses and the NEC terminology in there. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So that's just comparing the two. So that shows basically a gain situation, because you can see there the single line represents what the contractor has been paid as they go along. The dotted lines, the intermittent lines, are showing how the target is going up, because in this instance we've got quite a few compensation events clearly. So if we can have the next slide, please. And the next slide. I think we've covered everything. So terminating and assessing the contractor's share. All I wanted to cover here was that if an option C or D is terminated, so it's it comes to an end before contractor stroke subcontractor and a subcontract has completed its work, clause 90, which is the termination provisions, so as you can see there, 93.4, 93.6, requires a reconciliation based on the figures at termination, so that the parties don't lose out on, the assessment of the pay and gain share. So if there is a termination, the pay and gain mechanism still applies. So if we can have the next slide, please. So I think in conclusion, as I've said, so this here it calls it a hybrid, which sounds much more sophisticated than, in inverted commas, a mashup. Hybrid between options A and B for your target element, option E for the element that the contractor's paid. Contractors, subcontractors, ensure you're not taking all the risks, so that it's not if there are gains, contractor gets a very small percentage. you know, if there's some pain to be shared, the contractor bears all of that pain. And you know, be careful when you're setting your target cost, because as you know, you've seen, there's only very limited scope for it to be adjusted. So don't think of it as being a fluid figure. It really isn't. You know, it is like or very similar to your fixed price in your options A and B. So I think that's the last slide. If we can just yeah. So, happy, I don't know whether there've been any questions, happy to deal with any questions. And we've finished a little bit early, which is a small miracle.
Yeah, that never happens, does it? So no, thank you so much, Sarah. As it stands, there is no questions. If anybody does think of anything, then once I've emailed the slides out, then please pop the questions over to myself on email, and then I can get an answer from Sarah and share that with everybody. So as I say, thank you so much. I will send the slides out. I'll upload the recording to YouTube and send the link to our YouTube channel. And if anybody does want a certificate for CPD purposes, then just pop me an email over. In terms of the next webinar, so that will actually be happening in the new year now. So after Christmas, I can't believe we're talking about Christmas already. It seems to have flown round. So that's looking at JCT versus NEC, and the webinar will be Tuesday, the 28th of January. Or if you want to join us for the face-to-face breakfast seminar at the Bridge in Wetherby, that will be Thursday, the 30th of January. I'll just have one last check of questions. Yeah, nothing's come in. So thanks all for joining us, and have a great Christmas. See you in the new year. Bye bye.
Thanks, Jen.